everybody. I'm Susan Tomlinson Schmidt. I'm the president of the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance, and we're so glad you're here with us today to talk about risk leadership and what that means in the nonprofit sector. So here with me is Melanie Herman, Executive Director of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. Sorry, I got confused. So Melanie and I are going to have a conversation today, and we're glad you've joined us. Melanie, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and NRMC?
Sure, and thank you so much, Susan, for inviting me to have this conversation. I've actually been the Executive Director and CEO of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center for the past 25 years. So it's been an amazing run. I'm certainly an accidental risk manager. I did not expect to be on this path, but the organization that I lead is a nonprofit that has been around for about 30 years now. And its entire mission is to help leaders across the nonprofit sector get comfortable with risk, get comfortable facing risk and get comfortable taking risk. And it's really all predicated on a belief that we have, which is that nonprofit organizations need to take a lot of risk, and in most cases more risk than they currently do, to achieve their missions. So we're all about helping leaders, whether they're staff leaders, volunteer leaders, members of a governing board, really get comfortable thinking about, talking about risk so they can take more risk. And just in terms of my background, I have a bachelor's degree in urban affairs. I had planned to be an urban planner. That was my goal back in the day. And I attended American University in Washington. And then later, when I was working full-time at a nonprofit association, I decided to go to law school. And so I earned my law degree at George Mason University School of Law. And then I kind of fell into risk management. I managed an insurance program at an association. And while there, I heard about the opening here at the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. And it just seemed that it combined all of the things I was interested in and some of the things I was doing in my role at that association. And so I was super excited about applying for the job and have loved every minute of it. It's a different environment every year, right? The landscape, the risk landscape changes. And the clients we work with, the members we work with, change on an annual basis. And so I get exposed to so many interesting nonprofit missions. And it's really invigorating is the best way to describe it, the work that we do.
Well, I feel similarly about the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance. So, what we do is prepare talent for the sector. And so when we started preparing our schedule for this year, what content we wanted to offer as professional development. Certainly, risk leadership is something that we want our CMPs to be comfortable with, because I'm with you, I think it's just now more than ever so critical that, the gaps that we're trying to fill are widening, they're not closing. And without some really strategic risk taking, we're going to keep, just fill in the edges. We're not going to fill the gap. So our organization has been going through a lot of rebuilding over the last few years. My board might say I'm too comfortable with risk. If you want to know the truth, I'm high on the risk-taking scale. So that's why we wanted to partner with NRMC to build this initial course. Part of our strategy when we build content is to partner with the experts. So that's how we got together. So let's talk a little bit about the course and what people can expect, and then just the world of risk leadership in our sector today. So why do you think risk leadership is so important in today's nonprofit sector? We've talked a little bit about that, but what's going on that makes it so critical right now?
Sure. So I think risk leadership is especially important right now because I think many people have really come to accept that we live in a world of uncertainty. None of us knows what will happen next. And we're not in control of so many things that impact our destiny, right? As individuals, as leaders, and frankly, our organizations, right? There's so many things happening around us that we don't get to control. And uncertain events, disruptive events, crisis events are things that happen on their own time frame. And we don't get to control when they happen, how they happen, and whether they target us or affect us. So I think the global pandemic has really brought this idea to the forefront. And when I think about risk leaders, it's everything from somebody who's a full-time risk manager working in a nonprofit organization to somebody who's the executive director of a small organization who wears lots of hats, or somebody who's serving as a chief operating officer or chief development officer, in many different roles, chief financial officer, wearing that risk leader hat. So risk leadership looks differently depending on which organization we're talking about, but it's so important. A risk leader is somebody who guides people through uncertainty, right? Who supports teams. They help people get comfortable not knowing how things are going to turn out. And one of the ways that they do that is by helping teams envision, alternate destinations, right? Or alternate pathways to the same destination. And I think that's one of the things that makes this discipline so interesting. And it leads to people who have taken other pathways, right? Maybe a pathway to become a financial leader or a human resources leader or a leader in technology to say, I'd like to do this risk management thing as well. So we're seeing lots of different types of risk leaders come to the forefront in the nonprofit sector. And that's very exciting.
Yeah, I love that, because I think no matter what your role and what your position in an organization, there's opportunity to go big, right? And that's what we're looking for. And I do think you have to have a culture that allows for that, certainly. So there's some, you can't be at the very bottom pushing a stone up the hill, but if you are in the right environment, you're probably looking at leaders who want you to bring those big ideas forward, right? So that's great. Well, we work with a lot of different functions in the nonprofit organization. So you mentioned HR and finance. And what we know is there's some real misperceptions about those positions and what they entail in nonprofit organizations. What do you is that the case with risk managers, and what are some of the misconceptions about that role in a nonprofit organization?
Sure. I think the misconceptions fall into two kind of broad categories. So the first category is a misconception that also applies to HR, finance, technology, compliance, legal, right? All of those other functions. And that misconception is that all of these functions, and I would even put fundraising in that category as well, that those functions are infrastructure, that those functions support the organization, but they're not the real mission functions. And I remember working in an association where I was the manager of fundraising, membership, and communications. I had a pretty big budget. I had one of the larger budgets on the management team. And, I came into this organization all excited about doing this work and feeling kind of self-important, if I look back and I'm honest with myself. But one of my first days on the job, somebody told me, the stuff you do, it's not really mission work. And she said to me, I do the mission. You just do all that other stuff. And I remember feeling like, wow, what an awful thing to say to somebody who's really excited about their work. And so I say that, Susan, because I think that risk management, IT, HR, fundraising, finance often get grouped as the non-mission related functions, and yet nothing could be further from the truth. These are the functions that fuel the mission, that help the programmatic staff, right? The frontline staff delivering programs and services really do great work and make a difference in communities around the country. So I think that's one misconception, is that risk management is back of the house, other admin. That's one misconception. Another misconception is that risk people are all about things that go wrong, are all about imposing rules and constraints. And they're the people who tell us we can't do things and we shouldn't do things and be careful, right? They're the ones with the orange cones and the yellow tape and so forth. And I think it's important to try to dispel that myth. In the best organizations and some of the most incredible risk leaders I know in the sector are people that have such an optimistic view of the world. And they want to be the people that you go to if you're looking for innovative ideas. How do I get this done? We're looking at creating this new program and we've never done it before. What do you think? I want that risk leader to be somebody who says, that sounds amazing. Let's talk about how we can do it to increase the chances of it being successful and yeah, manage the chance that it might not go well. But I want to focus on what we can do to make it successful. So I think that's one of the misconceptions people have about risk managers or risk leaders, that they are negative, that they're rules-based, that they are very conservative in their thinking, don't take risk, right? Risk averse.
Right.
And I don't think those things need to be true. So lots of misconceptions. The last one just popped in my head. I was talking to a colleague earlier today who works in the insurance industry, and I told him, one of your jobs is to remind people that you can work in risk or even in insurance and still have a sense of humor. So I think sometimes people think risk managers or risk leaders are humorless. And we try to always bring a sense of humor to everything we do. And I hope it comes across in the articles that we write, in the courses that we develop, in the resources that we create for nonprofit teams.
Yeah, I've never seen you wear a pocket protector and show up at a meeting and be miserly. So you're a good face for risk managers. And I like the shift to risk leadership, because I do think it puts the right tone on what you're saying. A lot of the risk taking we do at the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance is about scaling up our programs. So we're not talking about taking payroll and going to the casinos, right? That's
right.
Not the kind of risk we're talking about. We're talking about mission related risk often. And that does take optimism. You got to believe you can change the world if you are in this business. So probably I would think the nonprofit sector is right for that type of person, because we are optimistic and we do want to change. We are looking for scale to change the world. So what are some of the other characteristics that you see in good risk leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. So in addition to a sense of humor, one that comes to mind, and we talk a little bit about this in the course, is problem solving, right? Risks are future actions, events, or decisions for which the outcomes are uncertain, and the outcomes could be could have a significant impact on an organization, right? So they're potentially significant events that aren't happening now, but could happen in the future. And so to be a good risk leader, to be an effective risk leader, you have to have a great imagination and be able to envision, what could happen if we do this thing? What could happen if we don't do this thing? And you need to kind of have that wide view. So I think a problem solver, puzzle solver, those are really important skills. And I think people that have that inclination are really drawn to the risk leadership. Another quality that I think is incredibly important is being a good listener. And this one's kind of hard for some risk leaders. And that's because many risk leaders and risk managers and risk consultants, right, are expected to have all the answers. And in fact, at the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, our tagline is "Find the answer here," right? So that's our tagline. That's what we do. We answer questions all day, every day. But the truth is, to answer questions and to provide good answers to questions, you have to learn how to be a good listener, because often the first thing somebody tells you is not the full story. And so when somebody calls, I tell my team, let them talk about what they're calling about, what their question is. That first comment or that first statement, the first question is just the opening to what they're really calling about. And if you're patient, you sit back and maybe you do some follow-up, ask some follow-up questions, you'll eventually get to the crux of the issue, the real reason they're calling. And I think that is true in an organization. So somebody may come and say, I have this idea about this program, or we're thinking about doing this. A risk leader who's a really good listener will say, tell me more, right? How will that work? Rather than, oh no, we've tried that before, or that'll never work here, or that's too risky, or we'll get sued, right? You cannot have a closed mindset to be an effective risk leader. You have to have that open mindset and that sense of curiosity and wanting to hear all the details. before you weigh in. I actually think introverts make great risk leaders. I had a staff member some years ago who would come to staff meetings and we'd be talking, and those of us who are more extroverted would be talking about ideas, and she would sit there and she wouldn't say anything. And then 20 minutes into the conversation, she'd speak up, and whatever she had to say was always brilliant, right? She was sitting there listening to the rest of us, processing and imagining different scenarios. And she didn't speak up until she had really thought it through. The rest of us were thinking and talking at the same time. So it was just a wonderful example that I think being a bit of an introvert can actually be an asset if you're a risk leader. So problem solver, listener, great communicator, somebody who's trustworthy. You've got to be trustworthy because you want people to confide in you. You want them to tell you what they're thinking, right? What they're thinking about doing before they do it. And that's actually, Susan, one of the biggest complaints that risk leaders have is that people come to them after everything has gone wrong, right?
Yeah.
And they want help cleaning up, when risk leaders really want people to come to them early on. But if you want to be the kind of person who people approach early on when the ideas are kind of half baked or not baked at all, barely mixed, you have to have that kind of warmth and optimism and that attitude that you're not going to run somebody down, you're not going to shame them, you're not going to be critical, you're just there to help, right? So I think all of those qualities are incredibly useful in risk leaders today. And luckily we have lots of people across our nonprofit sector who really exemplify those qualities.
Yeah, that's great. Sounds like they have to be a collaborator too. I mean, you're frequently working with the insurance company or the lawyer or, or program staff, like you said, to understand better. So
absolutely. And, just on that issue of collaboration, one of the most important skills that risk leaders need to have is having a sense and knowing when we don't have all the information we need, right, to make a decision. And so I'm always, I love to sprinkle lists of questions into presentations, whether I'm speaking to a board or a management team, a staff team. I always add questions to kind of spark that engagement. But a great question to kind of get at the holes in the thinking and the information is whose perspective is missing, or who would completely disagree with what we're about to do and why. And then why aren't they here at the table, right? Whether it's a virtual table or an actual table. Just stopping before you, hit start on any new activity to say, whose perspective is missing? Whose perspective haven't we thought about? Who would disagree? And why aren't they here? And maybe we should hang on a minute and get that perspective at the table. And that's what risk managers do, risk leaders do, is they identify those opportunities to widen the perspective and bring in those diverse points of view.
We were recently in a staff meeting and we were making a list of reasons why we would do something. And then we stopped and made a list of why we wouldn't. And that second list was actually much more powerful list to help us see, to help us make the decision as a team, right? So what is holding us back? Is it real or not? So I think, to your point, it's perspectives around the table. Do we have the right people? And are we asking the right questions? So
there's actually a technique too that we use from time to time here, and it's called Thesis, Antithesis, Synthesis. And the way it works, it's from George Hegel, who's a philosopher. And the way it works is somebody, you're talking about an issue or a challenge or a problem, and somebody comes up with a great solution. And, I'm sure you're familiar with the anchoring bias, where we tend to latch on to the very first idea, right? We've all been in staff meetings where this happens, where somebody says, why don't we do this? And someone says, that sounds great. Let's do it. Okay, let's move on to the next thing, right? So we anchor to the first idea. Well, thesis, antithesis, synthesis is this cool technique where when somebody says, why don't we do this? Someone in the room raises their hand and says, why don't we do the opposite, right? Just puts out there the opposite of that first idea. And then the subsequent conversation is all about what are all the ideas, the synthesis, the best of one idea, the best of another idea. What's a synthesis solution? And rather than just limiting ourselves to that very first idea, the thesis, and it's worked beautifully here. We've done it a few times, and I always have to laugh when a technique that we've written about, one of my staff plays that card in a staff meeting and says, "Why don't we do the opposite?" You know, and it's like, oh, that's great. We're practicing what we preach.
Yeah, well, that's great. Yeah, somebody in the chat said appoint somebody to play the devil's advocate, and that's always valuable for a conversation to get it going, right?
Right. And it's even more fun when that, why don't we do the opposite? You know, it's not always the same person, right? It's a different person. And people, once you use that language, you're not running down the initial idea. You're not discounting the initial idea. You're just trying to expand the view or the range of ideas as big as it can possibly be.
Right. Yeah. So we want to leave a little time to answer questions if there are any, but one question I want to ask you about, just from personal experience, I have a frustration that we have these powerful, successful business people in our networks, and then they join our board and they come to the volunteer position of running the organization, and they get very risk adverse. And they're entrepreneurial and not doing that in their own businesses. So how do we help our boards adopt more of this? Particularly as staff members not being on the board, how do we get them to see the importance of taking these risks?
No, that's a great question. I don't think I've ever worked with a nonprofit board that doesn't have some members who are risk averse, and my board has a few that I can always count on to be very averse to taking those bold risks. But on the other hand, if we were all huge risk takers, we might wind up in a bit of trouble, right? So that balance is kind of a good thing. So it anchors us, and it helps us get to that synthesis view. But if most of the board is risk averse, it's very, very challenging. I think one way to inspire the board to really play that risk leadership role is to put some very different risk questions in front of them, put some different questions in front of them. So my favorite risk question for a board agenda, for a management team agenda, for a workshop agenda, my favorite question is, what big risks should we take to achieve our mission, right? And when you ask that question, first of all, it turns risk management on its head, because people think risk management is about what could go wrong. What do we do if something goes wrong, right? When you say, what big risks should we take to advance our mission this year, right? So give it a time frame. Or in the next 5 years, what are the top 3 risks we must take to scale our mission, right? You can rephrase the question in different ways, but I think you can even ask it in that deliberate way that gets people going, wow, this is a fun conversation. I think if you put a question like that in front of your board, Susan, people will say during and after the meeting, I'm glad I didn't miss that. Like, I am so glad I was at that meeting where we talked about these risks that we should take. And they leave thinking, okay, so risk isn't just about all the bad things that could happen. And then another way to kind of inspire board leaders out of that tendency to risk aversion is to show them that you've got, this is what we're going to do. This is the plan. This is the bold risk we're going to take. But here's our backup plan. And here's what we're watching to make sure that we're paying attention to those indicators that tell us things aren't turning out the way we had hoped. And we've got these levers we can push to stay on track, right? So I think boards want assurances. And recently I presented to an audit committee just yesterday where, I talked about some risks, and I talked about some key risk indicators. Those are the things we're watching. I talked about the things we've already done. And then I talked about the things we've yet to do. And at the end of that presentation, I asked, does this inspire your confidence in our approach to managing our top risks? And the consensus of the group was yes. So I think there are a few things we can do, but I would definitely ask that first question about, what big risks must we take this year to advance our mission, to just change the way they're thinking about risk.
Yeah, I'm sure discussing it in a group like that helps people get more comfortable with it as well.
That's right. That's right. A
Hearing
lot
the other
of excitement.
perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing, I guess, just came to mind, and I'm sure you do this already, but it's so important to go around the room and hear from everybody, because every
Yeah.
board is made up of extroverts and introverts. And I've been on a board years ago where the very last person to speak happened to be the youngest board member and probably the most introverted. And what came out of her mouth was so brilliant. And it caused all of us to stop and go, wow, I hadn't thought about that, And so I think when the conversation is veering to risk aversion, it's important to say, let's go around the table and find out what everybody thinks. Let's hear from everybody. And yeah, that puts the introverts on the spot. But in those moments, I think sometimes you get the most brilliant insights and solutions and strategies and perspectives on really tough problems and challenges that an organization is facing.
Great. Well, I knew this would pass by quickly, but we're almost out of time. So let's see if we had any questions from the group. Katie, did you get any questions that you want to pose? Okay. Do you have any tips to balance your risk taking and risk conversion?
Yes.
Balancing it.
Yeah. So I think, one approach is what's called using like a portfolio approach to risk taking, where you don't want to be taking risk in every area, right? So our investments are risky, our programs are risky. We're hiring people without doing interviews, or So I think thinking about it as a portfolio and even just a simple chart that says, with respect to investments, here's our approach. With respect to spending money, we're taking this approach. With respect to programs, each year we're going to offer 2 new programs that we've never offered before, right? So they're a bit risky. We don't know how they're going to turn out, but we're always going to offer, in a way, it's the way I plan menus. When I'm cooking for friends and hosting a party, my tried and true method is always serve at least 3 dishes you absolutely know are going to be fabulous, people are going to like, right? And make at least 2 items that you've never made before, right? Take some risk, but I'm not about to take complete risk with menu planning. What if all 5 items on my list of appetizers, taste terrible and are inedible? So I think that portfolio approach and showing your board, showing your team, we're not going to the edge on everything, but we're going to go to the edge and actually take some bold risks in a few areas. And then we're going to do use some tried and true methods in other areas.
That's good. I like the portfolio approach idea. I can definitely see how it would work well in teams. So what are some ways you would ease a team into taking risks to grow?
Sure. So, I think this idea of, starting with where do we want to be, right? What's our goal? Where do we want to be in maybe not 10 years? Sometimes we think so far out in the nonprofit sector, we end up with these visions that just seem unlikely, right? Or that are too big. Where could we be in 2 years, right? And then what are the different ways we might get there? Right. So I would start with where could we be? And I would use a shorter time frame. Again, shorten it from 5 or 10 years. And in 2 years from now, where do we want to be? And then what are different ways to get there? What are some of the things that can happen along the way? Right. So those are the types of questions I would pose to kind of get a team comfortable. And then, of all these things we might do, which feel the most risky, which feel safe? And maybe we divide everything into these 2 categories: feels safe, feels really risky. And let's make sure we're picking some from both, right? It's almost like going back to the idea of food, right? You're choosing the meal. You're not choosing all from one food group for the meal, right? You're choosing some from multiple food groups. So I think making some choices from each side of the ledger, things that feel safe and doable and things that feel bold. It's another great technique to use when you're setting annual goals. When a team is setting goals for themselves, or when individuals are setting professional development goals, personal goals, is pick some things that you know you can do, but pick a few things that are stretch goals that feel risky. So balance is really important.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we're running out of time, but we have one last really good question. Have either of us misjudged a risk before, and how do we recover?
Oh my gosh, it happens all the time. And I think what we've learned in the pandemic is that we make mistakes. Human beings are wrong about a lot of things, right? Actually went to a campfire conference a couple of years ago where the speaker said, take out a piece of paper and write down everything you've been dead wrong about. I took out a piece of paper and for 2 minutes, I just scribbled. I had like 25 things. And I was sitting next to a dear friend of mine and I said, oh my gosh, Anne, you've got 25 things as well. She goes, I know, I've been dead wrong about so many things. So I think it's so important as leaders to just acknowledge we're wrong about a lot of things. We're not able to foresee the future. We're not good at forecasting. We're not psychics. And so when you're wrong, the most important thing to do is to say, I was wrong. And in fact, when you say you were wrong enough and admit it and show that vulnerability, members of your team will start to say, I was wrong. And I've seen it happen recently where someone who doesn't typically say, I was wrong, said, I was wrong about that, right? So it takes great leadership to say that you were wrong, and we're wrong about a lot of things. So try the exercise of writing down everything you were dead wrong about. And I think you'll be surprised at how many items wind up on your list.
So Adrienne Sargent has a study about how when you make a mistake, the way you correct it can be more powerful than getting it right in the first place. And I think that's, true in a lot. So his was about fundraising in particular. Okay. But I think it's true in so many ways. I think, particularly if you're taking a risk and your board is holding you accountable for whatever the outcome of that is, I wouldn't want to work for a board where I couldn't feel like I could go and say, that didn't work, and let's have a conversation about why and what we do next. So I think just in my experience, being forthcoming and just meeting it head on, not hiding it or playing with the numbers or whatever it is that you're reporting back on, just saying, we took a risk and it didn't work. And I think most people respect that.
Definitely. Yeah.
The majority of entrepreneurs don't succeed until their third try, right? So, businesses are used to risks not paying off. Well, this has been great. Time's flying by. I do want to be, respectful of everybody's time. If you want to learn more about risk leadership, we will be sending out a link to the course that Nonprofit Risk Management Center has generously put on our Leaderosity platform. And in the course, you can also find information about more of their training programs and how you can get up to speed on risk leadership and other topics. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Melanie. It was great having this conversation.
Thanks so much, Susan.